Is it Molly or?
It's me. I'm recording.
Oh, hey,
Oh, you are
hey, Molly.
recording. Are you, Molly, are you also like letting people in the waiting room?
Yep, I will be in charge of that.
I would like to welcome everyone to the new season, the second session of the new season of Balkan Circle. As you know, Balkan Circle is a biweekly seminar where lectures, presentations, exhibits, or open interactive dialogues focus on any and all, in fact, aspects of historical, political, economic, social, and cultural phenomenon on the so-called Balkan space. As you know, this seminar is free and open to the public, and we're always looking for constructive comments, participation. As today, I will be hosting the session. As you know, my name is Kirill Avramov. I'm an assistant professor at the Department of Slavic and Eurasian Studies here at UT Austin. And I'm thrilled to have one of our regular participants to have a very interesting presentation that I hope will spark a good discussion. Will provide us for food for thought. So today we'll be having Chris Haley, who's a PhD student in anthropology at the University of Texas at Austin, has an MA of anthropology at the University of Virginia, and is a third-year graduate student who has returned to academia after 15-year hiatus to finish his doctorate. And he's also that is good humor here. But he's one of the most valued members here at Balkan Circle. He's also the author of The Subject of Human Being, which is published in 2019 in the Routledge series Studies in Critical Realism. Today, we're welcoming Chris to talk about his upcoming PhD dissertation research project, which will take place part of the field work in the Rhodope Mountains of Bulgaria. And his talk will consist of two parts. First, Chris will give a brief overview of the general project, which examines how two Muslim communities, Pomak and Bulgarian Turk, respond to the so-called gift of infrastructural development funded by Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and the EU. And for the second part, Chris will consider the cultural logic of resistance to authoritarian power that manifests in Bulgaria and across the Balkans, and may inform how these communities actually negotiate with these external powers. So today we're having our presentation by Chris, which is titled "The Mosque at the End of the Road: The Geopolitics of Development Among Pomak and Bulgarian Turk Communities in Bulgaria." Very interesting topic, and I hope that, again, we will be having a great discussion at the end of the presentation. Chris, without further ado, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you. I'm going to share my screen and get this set up here. So just bear one moment. And hit this thing. Is that right? Okay. Okay. I think that should be right. Okay. Yeah. All right. First off, I would like to thank Mary and Carol for organizing the Balkan Circle and providing here in Central Texas, of all places, this opportunity for like-minded scholars. Normally, Balkan Circle talks are on completed research and a place to present results. I've had to structure my talk in a different way because I have yet to conduct my research and its parameters are still in process. And so I've decided to provide a brief overview of my project, which is about a quarter of my talk, and then in the remainder, move to a more speculative discussion of a particular cultural logic that I figure may be a prime dynamic in the communities I am working in. My talk is clocking in at just over 40 minutes, and I have a bunch of slides to share. And I know this is a smidgen longer than is best, but hopefully it will be worth enduring. Okay, and so the mosque at the end of the road. There we go. Uh-oh. All right, yes. Fronting the central public square in Breznica, a town in mountainous southeastern Bulgaria, are two prominent buildings, a socialist-era four-story administration building on the one side and a new brightly colored mosque on the other. The town hall is adorned with Bulgarian and European Union flags and placards describing EU rural development projects in the area. The mosque has banners offering free Islamic education, Arabic language lessons, among other services. From these two buildings emanate an array of resources for the 3,000 residents of Breznica: spiritual guidance, education, social services, infrastructural development, and so on. While Bulgarian governmental functions and EU development projects are an unremarkable part of daily life in this region, from my view, more curious is the tip-off a Saudi Arabian NGO built this mosque and is responsible for dozens of mosques in towns and villages in proximity. More curious still, the Turkish state as well is building mosques and organizing religious and language instruction in the same region. All these factors piqued my curiosity to do ethnographic fieldwork on questions how two Islamic communities in Bulgaria confront and negotiate geopolitical ambitions of outside powers at their doorstep. These communities' historic settlement in the Rhodope Mountains, through which traverses Bulgaria's southern border with Greece, has become the focus of EU, Saudi Arabian, and Turkish leadership and interests, all seeking to extend their hegemonic projects by enhancing their claims for legitimacy. They do so by promoting their versions of human flourishing, guided by an overriding ethos from the emancipatory modernity of EU development initiatives to eternal principles of revealed Islamic faith. On the face of it, each in their own way are offering social goods to these communities, services and resources that are open to and in principle designed to benefit everyone. The ethnographic focus of this project are two municipalities found in the Rhodope. The first, the municipality of Madan, is in the residence region of approximately 200,000 Bulgarian Sunni Muslims known as Pomaks, who are the descendants of ethnic Bulgarians, Bulgarian language speakers, formerly Eastern Orthodox Christians, who converted to Islam during the 16th to 18th centuries. The second, the municipality of Kirkovo, is located 35 miles east and in one of three regional concentrations of Bulgarian Turks in Bulgaria. Bulgarian Turks, bilingual Turkish and Bulgarian speakers, and Sunni Muslim are descendants of Anatolian Turks who emigrated to the peninsula over the course of the Ottoman Empire's political and military control of the peninsula. These Bulgarian Turk and Pomak communities overlap to an extent, but are relatively segregated due to mountainous geography and differences of primary language, heritage, and proclivities to endogamy, which is in marriage. They do share four salient features that bridge their differences and are foundational to my project: their Islamic cultural orientation, isolated location on a strategic highland border zone, political representation by the Movement for Rights and Freedoms, a political party created ostensibly to advance the interests of the approximately 1 million Muslims in Bulgaria, which is about 15% of the population, and co-participation in EU-funded rural development projects mediated by the Bulgarian state. By GDP and income, Bulgaria is the EU's poorest member country, and with highest rankings of corruption, press unfreedom, demographic decline, and many other markers of distress, tension is rife between people's life expectations and challenging social conditions. By the EU policy toward member country and regional equalization, billions of development euro have been sent to Bulgaria since 2008, dedicated to facilitating the promise of infrastructure, to amend these gaps, to bring a better future for the country at large. For Bulgaria's Muslim populations in the Rhodope, EU funds outwardly compensate for the border's enforced underdevelopment during Bulgaria's state socialist era. Infrastructural projects granted to these communities are forethought to enhance economic well-being, social solidarity, and viable community futures. The EU program most responsible for infrastructural development in Bulgaria is the European Regional Development Fund, or ERDF, created to strengthen economic, social, and territorial cohesion in the EU by correcting imbalances between its regions. ERDF program objectives are self-described as infrastructural provisions focusing on themes such as education, transportation, energy, and small to medium enterprises. Likewise, by state policy over the past 20 years, millions of Saudi rial and Turkish lira have been sent for the building of mosques, community centers, and language and religious education to promote their different philosophies of Sunni Islam and spread their influence. Saudi and Turkish infrastructure projects in Bulgaria, while not as expansive or funded as EU development programs, are suggestive of soft power approaches to advancing foreign policy goals. These goals flow from the current political leadership of each country, Prince Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia and Prime Minister Erdogan and his Justice and Development Party in Turkey. Saudi and Turkish geopolitical interests in the Balkans have become increasingly competitive since the Arab Spring uprising in 2010. Both Saudi Arabia and Turkey are state-defined bastions of Sunni Islam, and both countries seek to establish themselves as leaders in the Sunni Muslim world. Besides overt differences in foreign policy, they also have institutionalized different schools of Islamic jurisprudence as their state religion. Saudi Arabia promotes an orthodox school of Salafi Islam known as Wahhabism, while Turkey promotes a relatively moderate form, Hanafi Islam. The centerpiece of both their strategies is the renovation and construction of mosques. From the beginnings of Bulgaria's independence from the Ottoman Empire in 1879 to the collapse of state socialism in 1990, there had been widespread abandonment and/or destruction of mosques built over the course of 5 centuries of Ottoman rule, 14th and 19th centuries. And the hundreds that survived often need extensive repairs and modernization. In addition, several hundred mosques have been built in the past 20 years. And based on my exploratory research in the Western Rhodope during the summer of 2022, this trend continues as I encountered mosques just completed and ones in process of construction in the handful of towns and villages I had an opportunity to visit. Anthropologists have long recognized that a gift comes with implicit claims for reciprocity, its spirit of attachment, relationship, and recovery. So too in the form of development aid. Development funds pouring into this region from an array of actors presents an opportunity to examine the intersection of infrastructure and exchange, of what is given and what these communities return when pro-offered help is loaded with soft power claims for legitimacy and authority. My project thus is a ground-level investigation of the extent these two communities engage with these gifts of infrastructure development, what they take and make use of, what they ignore or reject, and why. Because of the specificity and materiality of infrastructure and their deliberate interjection in this region, my project has identifiable sites around which I will learn how community members understand and engage with the possibilities they hold. In this way, I foreground the lived experience of the individuals that compose these communities and the relationship between what is given by circumstance and what they bring into being by virtue of their own desire or will. The 4 following questions inform my research. How do community members make use of these infrastructures? How does infrastructure affect the local political economy through the import of money, expertise, and planning? To what extent does infrastructure transform social relationships across multiple scales, locally, regionally, nationally, and transnationally? Finally, what dispositions of attraction, ambivalence, or repudiation may be invoked by these infrastructural interventions as they convey different ideologies, values, and possibilities for livelihoods and/or self-transformation? Okay, so now with this project in mind, I am going to present an argument for a feature of Balkan societies that I have been considering for some time now. And this in a sense boils down to how Balkan peoples have negotiated the influence and the effects of the great game of geopolitics on the peninsula, played by external powers. I'm calling this a cultural logic. And the way I'm using cultural logic, and pardon the abstraction here, is to indicate a pattern of behavior, perhaps described as almost an algorithm that weds subjectivity and practice, and it can be reiterated in changing social contexts and across time. They are learned and embodied at an almost subconscious level, though not always, and typically reflect fundamental senses of right and wrong ways to approach the world around. In this way, cultural logics are interpretive and evaluative, but also performative and part of a shared toolkit of tactics of getting by in life. In that, they provide schemas for practice, thereby a means for self-fashioning and creating social relationships. The schema I am identifying is a cultural logic of resistance, and in more technical terms, is my hope to provide a description of this logic via a phenomenology of consciousness in conditions of oppression. Central to this consciousness is a gap or disjunction between what might be conceived as public and private, or external and internal realms of subjectivity. I'm going to build this argument with analytic resources to give form and context, and then give several examples that are suggestive, in my mind at least, of how this gap works in the tactics of Balkan Bulgarian peoples in their everyday lives. What is particularly striking to me is that several examples come from the era of Ottoman control of the peninsula, which suggests that even before we get to the 20th and 21st centuries, before even 19th century national liberation movements, the cultural logic I'm identifying has an old pedigree and deeply woven into the fabric of people's values, attitudes, etc. Consequently, my speculation is that the logic of this internal-external relationship can be considered a cultural resource that has endured as a practice for many centuries, but always ready at hand to be deployed in pragmatic ways in new political economic contexts to advance the project of ethical self-fashioning. And I'm using the term ethical here non-normatively to indicate whatever rules and principles people follow in their socio-political economic practices and relations, regardless of how anyone might judge them. So now caveat time. I say speculative because the cultural logic I'm trying to discern is more of an intuition on my part, based as it is on a loose collection of historical and contemporary social situations that I find similar. But it is conjectural, and I hope I'm not overstating its longevity and coherence, its relevance to the Balkan context, and in the more circumscribed cultural milieu I am conducting research in. There's also the question of the socio-geographical origin and extent of social and cultural forms, which in my case comes from my limited experience of traveling around in social studies of Europe. I have often found it a problem to know exactly what is the source extent of things. Is it European or Eastern European or Balkan or Bulgarian? Dumb example, but on my first trip to Bulgaria, I had never been to Europe before. And when I saw electrical plugs there, my first thought was, boy, Bulgaria sure has weird outlets, not knowing they are pretty standard across continental Europe. So it's all a bit hypothetical at this point, but I'm interested to see what you all make of this and if it resonates with your own understandings. My first move here is to turn to Jasmine Mujanović's 2019 book, Hunger and Fury. Mujanović discussed this book during a Balkan Circle visit in November 2021, I believe, and I found this book an epiphany. Even though his geographical focus is on the Western Balkans, I think much of his historical argument and political diagnosis is highly relevant to Bulgaria as well. And perhaps you could even say it is the master explanans of contemporary Balkan societies. From this book, I take his concept of elastic authoritarianism, its nature and historical development, as the default political economic structure, in his view, and I would agree, plaguing Balkan peoples. I've put together several quotes to give a concise statement of Mujanović's central thesis. If you remember, Mujanović argues that Balkan countries can be described as, quote, organized protection rackets or kleptocracies, as their economic policies remain rooted in clientelism, corruption, and dispossession, unquote. Mujanović refers to this, quote, combination of oligarchy and criminality, a central feature of the region's general historical development, as elastic authoritarianism, the process of persistent ideological mutation contrasted with static political and economic patterns. through which local elites have deliberately stunted social transformation processes in the Balkans since the 19th century, unquote. These, quote, elites who emerged in the collapse of the Ottoman Empire were educated in generational patterns of clientelistic and parasitic behavior, as wealth could only be obtained through plunder, through accumulation by dispossession. Force was always required, and the state's monopoly of violence was the premier way to accomplish this, unquote. Consequently, a virtually identical caste of elites has survived revolutions, wars, and geopolitical realignment while persistently suppressing the ability of ordinary peoples and citizens to participate meaningfully in the political process, unquote. Elastic authoritarianism, as a useful analytic and description of a general logic of social power in the Balkans and in Bulgaria, operating always behind the scenes of particular political systems and ideologies, thus would connect present-day oligarchic control of Bulgaria, described severally as competitive state capture, to the 4 decades of Bulgarian Communist Party rule, and presumably to the monarchical parliamentary democratic configurations operating between 1879 to 1944. In addition, these political forms emerge after 500 years of Ottoman control of the territory. Obviously, elasticity is an inappropriate descriptor of Ottoman rule in this era, and I think it's a good idea to be attentive to the processes and complexities of how Ottoman power was exercised and what might have been the actual opinions and feelings of Orthodox Bulgarians during this period. However, there was institutionalized political, economic, and religious marginalization of Orthodox subjects and examples of opposition to Ottoman rule, which I'm going to accept as evidence that Balkan Orthodox people felt some degree estranged by the political military occupation of the land, and helps explain the kinds of consequent responses that suggest a particular cultural logic of resistance. Consequently, I'm inferring that while there was a profound shift from Ottoman to local elite power in the emerging nation states of the Balkans, if we go backwards from Mujanović's analysis, the lived experience of non-elites in relation to political economic power may not have improved much, because ultimately the rigid authoritarianism of Ottoman power merely became elastic once the locals took over. Granting an enduring authoritarian political structure, in my analysis, gives rise to a number of social conditions that Bulgarian people have and continue to encounter and negotiate. Foremost is the issue of the legitimacy of political and economic power and its consequences on the ground. That is, say, to the lived experience of being in a system you find illegitimate and ways it manifests in subjectivity and practice in response. I am surmising, but I cannot but think this leads to a sense of alienation and dissatisfaction, all the while creating conditions for various forms of resistance, non-compliance, or at least an attitude of skepticism and cynicism to the power of rule. It is from this essential alienation, like those conditions Mujanović lays out, that I believe is formative of the gap in consciousness I am identifying. Precisely this issue of the legitimacy of rule has been raised for life under state socialism. And for my second move, I turn to Václav Havel's essay, The Power of the Powerless, and think through his everyman socialist subject, the famous greengrocer. Havel, I'm using this essay as a first step to understand the way people might respond to the type of authoritarianism Mujanović points to. Havel's essay was published in 1978 and has value as a historic document in the formation of Eastern European dissident activity after its publication, and retains value for its analysis of the workings of ideology and dissident responses to totalitarianism. It is probably not the case that Mujanović's Balkan-centered concept of elastic authoritarianism is appropriate to describe Czechoslovakian political economic structures before and or after its era of state socialism. I actually don't really know. But whatever the case, I'm assuming that for socialist elites and the advantages that accrued to them were similar for both Bulgarian and Czechoslovakian socialist experiences of authoritarianism of both elites and the masses, and hence Havel's analysis up north is relevant to Southeastern Europe. There are many things one could discuss about this essay, but I'm going to focus, like most people do, on Havel's analysis of the greengrocer and his storefront placard. In this scenario, Havel creates, quote, a manager of a state-owned fruit and vegetable shop places in his window, among the onions and carrots, the slogan, "Workers of the world unite," unquote. Havel goes on to give an explication of the motivations of the greengrocer and the semantic content of the slogan. I find his interpretation useful because in it, Havel reaches a level of specificity of subjectivity, that is to say, of an individual's first-person perspective and the beliefs and desires that shape it, which discloses the interaction of the greengrocer and the socio-cultural conditions of his existence. In this case, it's the character and content of the greengrocer's subjectivity in response to conditions of oppression. As Margaret Archer argues, a social theorist that deeply informs my thinking, it is through people's projects that the affordances and constraints of social conditions are activated and allows us to understand the nature of the powers that both agents and relevant social conditions bring to bear and the process and outcome of their interplay. So there's a spoiler alert. In the final analysis, I disagree with an important aspect of Havel's interpretation, but I'll get to this below. In Havel's interpretation, he argues the greengrocer is indifferent, as are most people in his situation, to the manifest meaning of the slogan concerned with worldwide class solidarity, in addition to the multitude that pass by it every day. The slogan doesn't express the greengrocer's real opinion, nor could he express a true opinion publicly. The action is perfunctory, but at the same time necessary. If he did not hang the sign, his standing as a good socialist citizen could be jeopardized with negative consequence. Nonetheless, in this context, Havel argues that the sign has a secondary sublimable meaning, what we might call as a kind of virtue signaling these days. The true or real meaning of the slogan is, quote, I, the greengrocer, XY, live here, and I know what I must do. I behave in the manner expected of me. I can be depended upon and am beyond reproach. I am obedient, and therefore I have the right to be left in peace, unquote. Havel argues this true message of the slogan is addressed to the greengrocer's superiors on the one hand and protects him from informers on the other. Havel goes on to argue that the sign allows the greengrocer to communicate to the authorities that he is willing to comply to their rule, at the same time allows him to retain his dignity by expressing a social positive, even though the sublimable message is relatively disempowering. Havel notes that if the slogan brutally expressed the greengrocer's true situation in society, saying, I am afraid and therefore unquestioningly obedient, quote, he would not be nearly as indifferent to its semantics, even though the statement would reflect the truth. The greengrocer would be embarrassed and ashamed to put such an unequivocal statement of his own degradation in the shop window, and quite naturally so, for he is a human being and thus has a sense of his own dignity. Thus the sign helps the greengrocer to conceal from himself the low foundations of his obedience, at the same time concealing the low foundations of power. It hides them behind the facade of something high, and that something is ideology, unquote. Havel's interpretation may be partially true or very true for some people living under socialist authoritarianism and accurately shows how ideology functions in this scenario. Thus, following, there may be a degree of fear and domination motivating the greengrocer to display the sign. But it's also hard to imagine the greengrocer would not be resentful in this scenario of the authorities monitoring his compliance and of the informants willing to snitch. Without considering this resentment, I am bothered by Havel's interpretation that appears to grant a power of mystification to the ideological function of the sign as a kind of false consciousness or Sartrean bad faith. Havel is saying that the truth of domination is concealed by the banner of the high ideal, and the greengrocer is buying into this ideal at some level to protect his dignity because, to repeat, it helps the greengrocer conceal from himself the low foundations of his obedience and the low foundations of authoritarian power. I'm not super convinced. I have reason to believe, conversely, few socialist subjects were acting with such self-deception of what was going on, and therefore, why not some kind of resentment or critical stance instead? I think the greengrocer would be quite conscious of both low foundations, but there are sufficient incentives to put up the sign, and at the level of public behavior and expression, pay lip service to the dictates of authority. If the ideological effects of the slogan are less about concealment of weak power, I would argue there is an additional subliminal message being connoted by the sign. Surprisingly, nowhere in this essay does Havel discuss, among the various dissident forms of expression, what in my understanding, granted as limited, was a ubiquitous form of descent to state socialism and its constant efforts of propaganda. And that is the ironic detachment and sense of cynicism that people felt, and how this manifested in the underground critical humor that developed during this time. Think of Slavoj Žižek's constant retelling of jokes from this era. Besides the sign connoting obedience and a political reputation above reproach, I would think the sign would also signify a subliminal cynicism because everyone understands the rules of the game, necessitating the sign in the window, conveying, of course I placed this dumb sign in the window, don't we all? If we think of this cynical messaging and its inside joke, then this points to the formation of a disjuncture between people's public performance and an internal sense of illegitimate political economic rule. And it is from this gap, creating a hidden space, that then people could express their truth. There's defiance in cynicism, and why there's nothing like a repressive and ideological state apparatus to appropriate Althusser's concepts for the development of poignant and snarky political humor. Such weapons of the weak may be passive-aggressive, but they do have effects. The subjectivity that Havel projects onto the greengrocer is too beaten down and state-captured. And despite Havel's analysis of various free spaces of dissent within social societies elsewhere in his essay, he makes no mention of the solidarity of cynicism and the shared wink of playing by the rules. Rules most people think give off a strong whiff of illegitimacy. The system, its idiocies, clientelism, and obvious failure to live up to its ideals was the joke. People knew what was going on, and true believers were considered simpletons or dangerous. In the Balkans especially, with its Mediterranean-style feasting culture from the social effervescence emanating from namasata, regardless of the level of dysfunction of the political economic context, people were going to have a good time, and nothing promotes social solidarity and sense of empowerment than the one-upmanship of belittling a corrupt and debased other of power. Thus, the subjective cast of the greengrocer towards totalitarian rule I am promoting, the double meaning of the slogan, or better, the double life of the sign in number 2, points to a key feature of subjectivity and practice that instantiates the cultural logic I am interested in exploring. I want to say that the greengrocer's relationship to the slogan in the window is actually displaying a developed lived experience of internal and external realms of subjectivity and practice that are coaxially related. Or more appropriate in this context, like a Matryoshka doll of inside and outside selves. Compare for a moment the greengrocer's sign in an American political season with its inevitable landfill of candidate signage in front yards. In the US context, there's more or less correspondence between the sign's person-party promotion and the beliefs and desires of the person who put up the sign, obviously a lesser political possibility for the greengrocer. In the US, the external visible life is representative of the internal life without obfuscation, and this transparent relationship is deeply informed by our high value on authenticity and Protestant ideology, all the while embedded in a political economic context that gives weight, at least in principle, to personal freedom. Of course, in the US, there are tendencies of misrepresentation, creating a disjunction between the internal-external relationship, such as we find in social media by influencers and the socially needy, of brag plaints and the projection of success, of a life of social, financial, and experiential richness. But the difference, in my mind, is that the greengrocer's misrepresentation is born from conditional necessity, while in the US, the internal, less confident, less successful, flawed self, that self-promotion and self-branding seeks to hide, might be considered as the infiltration of the cultural sphere by the values and logics of late capitalism. So let me pause for a second and sum up what I'm trying to say. Authoritarian, totalitarian, political economic power, especially when it's considered illegitimate, creates conditions in which people find it advantageous to develop an external life that misrepresents and therefore protects an internal life they think is real and true. There is a parallel relation here. If we accept a longue durée of authoritarianism in the Balkans, it seems right there would be a parallel longue durée of resistance. This then is the other side of the story, or the complement to Mojanovich's thesis. In general, I'm going down a well-trodden road. As far as I know, there are four main theories that attempt to pin down socially constituted disjunctures or gaps in consciousness. Marx's notion of false consciousness of the working class, W.E.B. Du Bois' double consciousness, the internalized self-perception of being both Black and a nominal citizen in a context of a race-based hierarchy, Simone Beauvoir's notion of se faire objet, the self-task of women to become an object for men in Western patriarchal society, and, while not so much a consciousness deriving from social power differentials, though it can be, Sartre's mauvaise foi, the self-deception or bad faith of the existential subject. There are specific psychodynamic theories of gaps in consciousness that indicate a split between self and reality, projection, paranoia, depression, etc. But what's going on in the Balkans is clearly not individual psychopathology, somehow writ large. And in my mind, none of the general theories capture the exact nature of this creation of an internal-external lives that Balkan peoples create. I think Du Bois' concept comes closest, but the racism Du Bois argues forms Black people's double consciousness is not applicable to the more class-based elite, non-elite distinction in the Balkans, because Balkan peoples generally don't internalize their social marginalization in this same way. The effects of Balkan patriarchalism is another story. It may be the case, the form of consciousness that arises from the cultural logic I'm identifying can be found the world over in different contexts of authoritarianism, and certainly the world has plenty of examples to cross-compare. But however universal this might be, it is only instantiated in particular circumstances, and the Balkan context provides a vantage point to see how this kind of gap is created and how it operates, because the responses to authoritarianism reflect both the particular political economic conditions of domination in the Balkans and the specific response of Balkan peoples negotiating these conditions. With all this in mind, I'm going to now turn to several examples from the Balkan context that brought me to start thinking in the first place about the form of consciousness involved and what kind of subjectivities lay behind these examples. I'm only going to give a bare bones description of these, and much more could be said about the specific motivation and practices involved. The practice of crypto-Christianity. Granted, the historical record is murky. During Ottoman control of the Balkans, there is evidence of individuals or groups who outwardly or publicly professed Islam, but in private, in the confines of home and secret communities, continued to practice their Orthodox or Catholic faith. There were economic motivations and social advantages to publicly profess Islam, yet at the same time, as a matter of conscience, to retain a Christian faith. Number two, the practice of double naming. In line with crypto-Christianity, this is the practice of having a public Islamic name while also having a private Christian Slavic one. The historical evidence of this came to light generally at the Tanzimat reforms in the Ottoman Empire, enhancing religious freedom, among other reforms. Islamic converts began reverting to Christianity and claim their real name. The Balkan historian Mark Mauser, remarking on the motivations for this practice, describes this as the ability to, quote, dodge between inconvenient official categories, also serving to keep a man's real name hidden. Suleiman turns out also to be known as Constantine, Hussein as Georgi, unquote. Number 3, the practice of tax avoidance. A typical sentiment. Who pays all their taxes in Bulgaria, you might ask? You'd have to be a fool because half your money will end up financing some oligarch seaside villa in Turkey. Most of us with Balkan experience, I'm sure, also have encountered small business owners who claim if they fully followed the law regarding their tax obligations, their business would not be viable. I believe tax avoidance, under-the-table labor, and the like constitutes a system of cash circulation that remains more or less outside the ability of the state to touch. In this way, the cash economy constitutes an internal world, while above-board credit and payments, formal banking, investments, etc., an external one. The practice of fooling missionaries. This example, which Carol recently reminded me of, as a kind of reverse crypto-Christianity, highlights the supposed success of Protestant missionaries in the 1990s and 2000s among the lower registers of Bulgarian society, notably the Roma. In this case, people apparently convert to whatever Protestant sect is being promulgated and begin taking advantage of these missionaries, usually for financial gain. And finally, number 5, the practice of Christian orthodoxy. At my most speculative, this example does not quite model the cultural logic I've been describing because it's not exactly an authoritarian power structuring experience within the faith, unless God is the ultimate authoritarian power Balkan peoples have had to contend with. This is a good question for our Jason Roberts, but I sense there is an internal-external relationship of the sort I'm trying to identify, operating at its core. This has to do with how ritual works in orthodoxy. I'm wondering if a basis of the faith is not so much the exact degree of faith as an internal relationship of the self to God, of what you feel inside, but subservience to biblical commandments and participation in required rituals. If I'm at all correct, orthodoxy would function most directly in distinction to Protestantism, with its emphasis on a personal relationship with Jesus and the internal dimensions of one's faith. Orthodoxy would be much more about one's behavior as a Christian, with an emphasis on ritual as that practice. Key moments then of becoming and being a Christian would be center on being baptized, participating in church services, and going through the motions, doing what church leaders say is right and wrong. And this is sufficient for being a successful Christian, going to heaven, not going to hell. Concerns of what one actually thinks and feels is not the main question or target for church intervention. And if this is all right, then once again, we see an iteration of the distinction between an inside and outside. And perhaps orthodoxy prefigures or sets the stage in a generalized sense for more specific responses to authoritarian powers. So my speculative move here is to draw from all these examples a common cultural logic. They are united in form, as each one involves a practice that brings to light a distinction between an internal world of experience and value and an external world of public accommodation to political economic otherness, which may be felt as irrelevant, oppressive, and or illegitimate, or at least unreasonably demanding. And of utmost importance, what also unites them is the community judgment by friends, family, etc., of one's deception and misrepresentation to authorities, to outsiders, to those who aren't privileged to participate in one's real internal sphere, is not just permitted as a tactic of getting along in the world, but is judged a supremely moral act. You have every right, almost a duty, to fool the authorities by carving out a space of self-transcendence and community inside a political economic context that your own deems illegitimate. Okay, thank you. I will stop sharing here.
Thank you very much. I do appreciate it. I would like to give a hand, to the presentation because I believe it gives a lot of thought. And of course, before I open the floor for discussion, I'll offer several remarks in order to set the tone for our discussion today. What I am really interested, in your future work, and especially after the field work is done, quite obviously you're putting a very interesting phenomenon in focus, and this is the infrastructural sort of development of peripheral regions in Bulgaria, which receive specific attention from external actors, and they create spaces and infrastructure which are gifts, with the expectation that there will be some sort of transactional sort of relationship occurring between the local residents and the promoters of this soft power. And I find this fascinating. What I will be interested for you to comment later on is the element of cynicism, in my mind, which should play some sort of a prominent role in what I deem to be here in my notes while you were reading and presenting. I took a note of what in my mind, those are strategies for success of the local population. So let's call them resistance strategy, because resistance. But I would, so my question would be twofold in this case, and question comment. The element of cynicism, how do you view this kind of in a long durée in the context? And number two, is there, if we agree that the logic that you have presented to us is that we are seeking to examine strategies which are representing resistance against illegitimate or demanding, as you said, highly demanding, unreasonably demanding center or external powers, are there rather other strategies of success, which would be co-optation or some other form that would manifest itself, whether by using the infrastructure or use it as a negotiation tool in this transactional game? I know it's a little bit lengthy, but because it's so complex and rich, and it's a very complicated phenomenon in my understanding. The one that you're putting on the dissecting table. The floor is yours, Chris.
Yeah, no, I mean that's I was bringing up this cultural logic just because it just seemed to me like, when I was sort of thinking through Mojanovich's work, and then thinking through all these these kind of historical examples, and but maybe there's other ones, and maybe people have other better examples, and certainly we run across those things. But you're like, the way that people are responding to all of this, there's just, I wanted to just highlight this kind of gap of, of this difference here, and the way that people are sort of thinking about the way that sort of presenting themselves to authorities, and then creating this space where they can actually kind of function and do what they need to do. And then, as you're saying, like co-option, I mean, the other strategies involved that people are sort of dealing with these external powers, that's some of that will be, the research will be about these other strategies. And I just highlighted this one of this kind of general resistance as something that's always going to be sort of present, that people, there's sort of a skepticism that you always find about, say, in these communities. There's just a little distance. They want to be like, yeah, I don't really know what you guys are up to, but I'm going to sort of wait and see and let this play out. Within that frame, then, these infrastructural gifts. This is where I think doing ethnography and really spending time with the way that people, in probably subtle ways, are engaging with these things. And yeah, co-option would be a way. My guess is that these projects come into these communities with a certain kind of intention. There's a purpose to them, and the question is what actually happens in response. And my guess is you're going to see a wide spectrum. Some people are going to just be, this is I'm not going to engage in all. Some people are probably pretty excited about this, but there's going to be that middle ground of people kind of making use of this in some way, in precisely in their own projects, and that's their own of
So sort of
getting
incorporating them into local sort of success strategies, like individual, that is.
Right. And that could be, there could be interesting, sort of community differences about way men and women approach these things, or people who have a little bit more social power versus lower social power, people in these communities, and what they can, the other resources that they bring to bear to make use of these infrastructural projects. I mean, something like these EU projects. What are these things? It's always kind of mysterious. Half the time there's a sign and they're like, yeah, well, there was a project, but I don't really know what happened to it. But some of this is, well, was there any engagement here? Who made use of these things? And in what ways did the project by intention fail or succeed? And how much of that was because of the really the different ways that people were engaging with these things and, better, or let's say more successful or less successful ways that ultimately, brought about the success or failure of the project itself. Even I think the mosques themselves, I mean, are they full, on Fridays or at the required times? Are they empty? What people, people are getting money. There's presumably in some ways for education, travel, how does that, what other things are going on? And I think that, I was trying to talk about this kind of internal, external situation. Sorry, I keep hitting the mic here. That what you see on the outside of someone going through the motions in the Balkans, do not read in what looks like a particular performance mirrors what's on the inside, because people have strategies and they're things look above board or a certain way, but really their motivations and interests could be quite different.
Yes,
and that's why I was trying to bring up the U.S. context of trying to say, hey, we have more of an expectation that the kind of public life and the private internal sense are collapse more transparently into one another. But I think in the Balkans, it's very okay to have a big gap between what's going on, and so that's sort of my point.
Well, thank you very much for clarifying this. And of course, in my mind, there is a reason why I said about, sort of cynicism, because it's connected, in my mind, at least, the discrepancy or the gap between outward manifestation and, private, if you will, life that you've illustrated, or, within a close-knit social circle, as you said on Namasa, so you're having this entirely different sort of conversation, conceptualizing your place in the hierarchy, the legitimacy of power mainly, and so on. So thank you for touching on this. I would like to open the floor for questions and comments from our participants today. Would anyone like to comment, ask Chris questions, give suggestions? Thank you, Christian.
First, congratulations to Christopher. It was very interesting, also a little bit abstract for me. And how to say, because I am historian and archivist, so it was a little bit abstract. But Christopher, what is actually what is actually the stage of your research? You start, you are at the beginning, or you have to finish it? Because and that is how to say lead to my second question. What actually data you were able to use in your research? For example, I mean, and to bring back discussion on the headline of your talk about the influence of the Saudi Arabia in the Rhodope Mountains and reconstruction at mosques and so on and so on. What kind of data you are plan to work with?
Right. Okay. So to the first question, the plan is to begin this research at the end of the coming summer. So I'm in stage, yeah. And yeah, so everything is kind of in motion towards that goal. And then typically in anthropology, we would do a 1-year field work
So
year.
you are at the beginning after all.
Yeah. So I have not started the project formally. I mean, I started, this was like last summer was my first time in the Western Rhodope. I've been in Eastern, but that was like one of the last places in Bulgaria I had not gotten down to. And of course I was amazed. It's just, the Western Rhodope Western Rhodope are amazing area.
Definitely.
So in my presentation, I did not talk at all about my methodology and the various ways I'm going to be collecting data. I have a kind of a couple stage process. The first is going to be mapping. So I've chosen municipalities with majority Pomak Bulgarian Turk communities, and I'm just going to do a complete historical and structural analysis of what all the different EU projects that have gone on, and probably World Bank projects prior to 2008, of where were they, what were they, where were they centered on, and try to get an idea of just kind of the scope of EU stuff. At the same time, map all the mosques that are in these regions. And again, think about, there's several interesting eras, mosques that were built before independence, mosques. And then I'm guessing there wasn't a lot of mosques built after independence up until 1990. But there's some an era of post-socialist mosques from 90 to say 2008, and then EU era mosques. And so then you get sort of a historical timeline of when all these were put together, and start doing close histories, or what I would call a micro history of each one, like who built it. Again, it's gather as much information as possible for the EU projects as well. Who built these? Where did the materials come? Who worked on them? And and then get a contemporary sense of who's making use of these. And that will transition to the other part of all these infrastructural interventions, is to start doing, participant observation, and really try to find as people who are making use of these infrastructures in whatever way, and start get a sense of how they're making use of them, and get their stories behind that.
Thank you. Go
Yeah.
ahead. No, I hope Christian just answered the question, but if there's something more.
Because I have how to say, a little bit experience of that kind of competition between Saudi Arabia and the Republic of Turkey in matter of digitization of the Ottoman archives here in Sofia. So there's a lot of interest from both countries, and it's very interesting topic. So I wish you success, and when you come here in Bulgaria, contact me. We will be able to come together to Rhodope Mountain. I have also a plan to some kind of project about photographing the old mosques and old churches there. So that will be interesting.
Yes, I can see us wandering around the hollers and hills and hollers of the Rhodope for sure. That'd be way cool.
Thank you, Christian, and thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
This is another added benefit, which I'm so happy to see, which I always fail to highlight, but it's actually happening. Maybe it's not recorded publicly, and it's for the better, but the cooperation between different members of the circle. I'm aware of several such instances, and Christiana, I do like to thank you as well, for extending opportunities for people to be helped, when they're doing their researches and so on. So thank you. There is someone that I'm passing the word to that hasn't been here for a while with us, and I'm so glad to have him back. Nuri, glad to have you back in the circle. I assume that you were busy, that's not because you didn't want it to be part of the circle, but it's probably because traveling and teaching. But the floor is yours. We're thrilled to have you back.
So much for giving me the floor. Yeah, obviously it was because of the project's new European chair issues that we tried to launch here in Bursa. So that's why I had to travel to Austria and Italy for other connections. And Chris, thank you very much for your presentation, which was very interesting to hear from that conceptual point of view. However, as someone who is coming from the municipality of Kirkovo, where I grew up until the age of 13, I could tell you that definitely you mentioned about the Eurorec projects and funding, which is providing an insight about for the period of the post 2007 after Bulgaria joined the EU. Nevertheless, as dealing with the border regions, perhaps you also heard about the IPA, which is the Instrument for Pre-Accession Management in pre-accession actions, actually, in the case of Bulgaria, where border regions were also eligible for this type of funding in order to reconnect, mostly to make the borders not only a periphery, but instead a point of attraction for the new EU member countries. So my question was, did you also encounter such projects that were, are you also dealing or conducting research about the projects that were conducted with the IPA funding? Because before the accession of Bulgaria to the European Union, this type of projects were from 2000, from 1997, when the Bulgaria's candidacy was approved, until 2007, for a period of almost 10 years, the projects were more widespread, and they are still actually going on. But Instrument for Pre-Accession Management was most spread type of funding for the border regions. So do you also consider conducting research about it? Thank you.
No, for sure. I actually I'm not aware, I've not heard of that program along the border there. So that's super interesting. And so can you write out the initials of that? It was like EPUM or
IPA, IPA.
Oh, okay. Okay.
But this is also part of inter-regional cooperation projects, which usually goes through cross-border cooperation. And
Right, okay.
on the other side of the border, it's the Greek region that is eligible for. In order to create a project, they should go through these common ideas of organizing events and also do some joint actions. And this is mostly to show that the two sides are actually cooperating and organizing joint events and showing this solidarity of creating a European, let's say, identity, how it actually shows. Because for a very long period, this region was a very hard border during the Cold War period, and it was actually the line of division between the Warsaw Pact and the NATO. And therefore, in my village, for instance, which is also in the municipality of Kirkovo, we had several military bases that were there, and the surveillance was 24/7. You know, it was never interrupted.
Right.
And however, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the change of the regime, these all military bases were closed. And now it's actually nobody is there. Like it's a very different, let's say, change in the border regions. So this is why that was the question that I tried to ask you, because you are explicitly dealing with very sensitive border regions, and from one village to the other, the ethnography is changing very drastically. And obviously, I don't know to which extent it's correct, but to show the cooperation and the contest between the, let's say, the contesting part of the Turkish and the Saudi Arabian part, perhaps Kirkovo region is not very good catch. Mostly I would say Madan would be, and maybe Velingrad area where the Pomak population is more white. But in the Kirkovo area, there is no such problem in general, let's say. But to compare both, it's a good case.
Right. That's what I understand that these communities, but what's and there's the Saudis are much more focused on the Pomaks, and Turkey, of course, on the
Exactly.
Bulgarians. I'm kind of fudging that a little bit, or just kind of keeping it open about what's going on or the way I presented it. But I am aware of that. Also, yes, I mean, as like this border area, like because all these villages were tucked in this kind of a militarized no-go zone, you know, for 40 years, and underdeveloped as sort of a matter of state policy as kind of fifth column elements of the population there. So it's, you know, one of the things that, it's really interesting as this kind of sensitive border space that all these projects are going on. That it remains, a strategic, sensitive border area. Greece and Bulgaria have their different policies towards their minorities. But I'm really interested in this IPA stuff. I've never run across a reference to this some kind of development funds that were moving into the area for pre-accession development or whatnot. And certainly that's another layer of sort of infrastructural development as a gift that was brought in, and so adds another layer to this story that I'll certainly keep in mind. Yeah, for sure.
But is that already before the joining of Romania and Bulgaria, European Union made an announcement, and already before the Eastern enlargement as well, saying that we don't have the necessary funds and the financial resources that we had before the accession of Greece, Spain, and Portugal. So therefore, we think that they may not be, good financial developments in these two countries or the 12 countries that joined the EU as it was during the 1980s when Spain, Portugal, and Greece joined. So
oh yeah, no, you hear that all the time. It's like by the time Bulgaria and Romania showed up, it's like, oh yeah, those guys got all the goodies, and Bulgaria and Romania are kind of like scratch. You're like, thanks.
We started all
nowhere clear, nowhere close to what was then before.
Yeah, and the subsidy deals and all this. I mean, stuff is just
absolutely.
Yeah.
I would like to thank very much Nuri, and Nuri, I would also invite you when Chris heads out for his research, if you have any advice for engagement in terms of what Christian was talking about, data collection in specific regions, more than welcome.
We might help him with anything we can, especially with contacting him and putting in contact with him, like people from the region, especially like from the municipality, let's say leaders, to the people who are attending the mosque. So therefore, he can observe everything from a distance and even contact with the local people there without any problem, especially in Kirkova area.
Okay, that
also
would be perfect.
But he's mostly doing research in Kirkova, so Kırjeli is definitely very interesting case study to conduct such research. I mean, sure, we could be if I can be of any help.
Okay, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Nuri. I didn't want to put you on the spot, but I know that sometimes the collective expertise, in the circle and, the network that we have as scholars and as citizens and so on, sometimes is helpful to someone else's, research, and I do appreciate this. So thank you very much. So questions, comments for Chris's presentation? I haven't seen an indication, but I was listening carefully, like taking notes. Catalina?
Okay, yes. Hi. I am a scholar interested in the Dobruja region of Romania today, who works on the Muslim minority there in the Ottoman period and the post-Ottoman period. So listening to you, thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting. I just wanted to encourage you to go deep into the history of the Balkan Peninsula, and especially the Pomak area during the Ottoman period, because you may find many nuances to this concept of elastic, how did you call it, authoritarianism, because the Ottomans have never been the same century from century, and they have never been the same throughout the century of reforms, the long 19th century, and you might find nuances there. And also I encourage you to get in touch with historians of the Ottoman Empire. Rosica Gradeva comes to my mind now, who is really a remarkable historian and human being, and she could direct you towards important scholarship. I'm saying that because I think that we need, as Ottoman historian, archivists, and Christian probably would back me up, we need to change the classical traditional view of the Ottomans being oppressors and, you know, putting the Christians in a corner and never taking them out from that corner and that hole, because it's not that way. And at the local level, you will see this dynamic play in an extraordinary fashion. You will see that at the level of local society where you go. So I encourage you also to ask your colleagues to give you access to whatever Ottoman material they have, and if you do not have expertise, try and ask for people who do, to help you get to those documents to create a more complex view of the Ottoman past and connect it with the present. I think that would be your most important contribution from our point of view. Historians of the Ottoman Empire, we're always eager to learn more information about that. Not many people have done it. So if I remember well, in some past decades, Ali Eminov wrote about it. But as I said, Professor Rosica Gradeva would be an amazing source for you. So I would contact her personally and ask for support in this direction, because it's important to correct this bias about the Ottomans being there.
Right. No, I had a little paragraph where I was trying to maintain some space in that argument, but I understand it was much more complex than the kind of knee-jerk, especially nationalist-inspired Bulgarian historiography.
Yes.
Right. Which, yeah, and so
both stories need to be told. The story of the nationalists and the story on the ground. They both need to be known and critically looked at, because they both matter. Right. And also looking at the textbooks and see what's taught in Bulgaria about the Pomaks and in Europe and all that. So maybe that will create layers to your study and will make it interesting and more accessible to all of us interested in that area.
Okay. Thank you very much, Catalina, and
You're
Chris
welcome.
as well. I really do appreciate this. And actually, this is a fine remark, actually, that I kind of think that should be repetitively made. As Yasmin, who was twice, and all of the people that deal with the period and the intricacies, as scholars, we have the moral duty actually to avoid kind of the shablon, the stereotype, of this, good, bad, politicization and so on. And I agree with you that the more nuance and the more effort into putting, real understanding, going beyond the cliches of the, which is necessarily politicized, and, the horrific part is actually pitching people against each other. So it's our duty. So thank you for pointing this one out. It needs to be done. And I think it's also, as Chris as well, is going to to investigate on the spot, the findings of those, articles, books, that's another appeal, that I always, have, should be publicized, and, they should be read all the way in high school and so on, in a sense that in order to escape this infinite, loop that, unfortunately sometimes the Balkans, and I'm getting mad when I hear the term Balkanization is used, as if, but, it's part of our job. So thank you for being here and standing for each other. This is really means a lot. I have an indication that Dan, we don't see you on camera, but you have a question or a comment, for Chris. So floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Haley. Thanks for the presentation. I think you guys have already talked around what I'm asking, and I apologize if you've said you're going to say this more than once, but I noted in the first part of your presentation, you talked about the community sharing isolation, and I kind of took that to mean maybe lower economic activity, and that sort of thing. And I was just wondering, when it comes to like local governing bodies, local Bulgarian governing bodies, are these guys and girls and people, are they willing to tolerate this infusion of money or funds, resources, kind of from a, I don't know, I want to use the word pork barrel perspective, but anyway, are they willing to tolerate the political risk because there's no other opportunity, no other economic opportunity?
Well, I would say, yeah, I think pork barrel politics is one way you could think about this. I think a lot of my guess is that, and this is speculating on my part, little that I know, but that those projects are, and I only made a very brief reference to this. A lot of these projects are mediated through the Bulgarian state, which means that they're mediated through the parliamentary system and through the political parties. And Amelia's talk 2 weeks ago about say how the movement for rights or freedoms is operating in these areas and communities. Really, yes, is very much part of the story. These monies are really maybe part and parcel of their political power. It's one of the ways that the gift of these external powers, you end up having local actors kind of ride along the gift, because they're ultimately the ones that are more specifically directing what exactly is going on, how these things are being implemented, where they are, and whatnot. And those are all the nitty-gritty details that I'm hoping to explore when I'm doing more of these kinds of micro histories of these infrastructural developments, because that social political history that each one will have is going to be really telling about the way that these things are being used, domestically, nationally, regionally, and then and the way that connecting these very small mountainous communities to to Sofia and to the center of power. And there's votes, there's influence. This is as Amelia was saying, this is part of the machine of politics. And if we go back to the kind of notion of is it authoritarianism or competitive state capture, this is the way that the local is being integrated into the national via political parties, via these monies. If that sort of answers the question.
Yes, thank you. Well, I don't want to be Americo-centric, or cynical, but are they willing to take the money and all the time in the back of their mind they're thinking, go ahead, build your mosque here, nobody's going to use it, and in the meantime we get so many jobs. Anyway, I hope you're able to, if you are able to document that.
No, I absolutely agree. Who's building these? I mean, there's wages. Where all the raw construction materials. Whose brother's business did that stuff come from, or whatever? This is just money coming in, and it's going to be networked, and it's going to reestablish patron-client relationships, and this is about the reproduction, let's say, the political economic status quo. And I think a lot of these gifts are doing massive kind of social work. And so as a gift, there's a lot I think these things are going to be really dense instances of all the connections and the way that people are sort of riding along, making use of these things, not only from the local people who are trying to make use of them, but there's this middle ground of the people who are organizing and building and what's going on here. So this is all part of the, I'm assuming will be part of the story of how this is working out.
Thank you very much, Chris. Dan, I assume that this was, this answered your question and addressed the questions that you have. Thank you for asking and commenting. As we're approaching, almost the finish line, of our session today, I would like to ask, one last time, if anyone didn't have a chance, to ask or comment on Chris's work, or wants to, say something in conclusion, please indicate to do so. If not, let me see what the chat says. Okay, chat is networking among, the participants in the Balkan Circle, and we're all beneficiaries from that. So at this point of time, could you please give a hand to Chris? And we would like to ask him come back to the circle once we have more data. I want to wish him a very productive trip. Certainly a fascinating topic, certainly a lot to be gained and discovered. And we all will feel, better and richer. And, after this dissertation, I hope, will become his second book, which I have no doubt it will. So thank you. На добър час. Благодаря. Teşekkür. Mulțumesc. And I'm looking forward to see you again in the circle, in 2 weeks. Don't be strangers. I'm so glad again. Nuri, it was nothing personal. We just are happy to have, our regulars, to be back. And when they're missing, we start questioning ourselves, like why, where did we go wrong? So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.